Hello and welcome to Absolute Trust Talk. I'm Kirsten Howe, and this is our live streaming podcast at Absolute Trust Council. Today, we are going to pick up where we left off in our last episode, talking about community property and separate property. In the last episode, we kind of laid out some of the basics and what we are looking at when we're doing planning. Today, we're going to share with you maybe some stories, some horror stories, things that went wrong in the realm of community property and separate property in estate planning, and what we did to fix the situation. There's almost always some kind of a fix. Again, joining me for this really fun conversation is my colleague, Ruth Koller Burke. She is also an estate planning attorney. Her company is Kohler Hurley LLC, and they're in Walnut Creek. Ruth her work is similar to ours, probates, trust administrations, estate planning, but she brings a lot of litigation experience to her practice, which I think is particularly helpful when we have families that aren't exactly getting along. And that happens from time to time, believe it or not. So Ruth, welcome back. And thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. Okay, so as I said, last time we talked about the issue of character, that is separate property versus community property. We call that the character of the property. And we talked about some of our planning techniques, some of the things we think about. Today, we're going to talk about a few examples of poor or non-existent planning and what you can do when those kinds of things happen. Ruth, do you want to get started?
Sure. So if someone dies without an estate plan, it's called intestacy. And who gets things then? Where does everything go? And really, the state of California has laid it all out in the probate code. And there are different rules for distribution depending on whether the property is characterized as community property or separate property.
Right. And so because of those different rules, we can have results that people didn't contemplate, that if they had taken the time to do planning, they probably would have done differently.
Right.
The basic rule is if you die intestate and you have community property, your surviving spouse gets the community property.
Right.
If you die intestate and you have separate property, your surviving spouse may get the separate property, but not if you have children who survive you. Then they are going to get a share of your separate property. And if you have a deceased child, but a grandchild, same thing. If you have the complexity, the challenge is that if you die intestate, your spouse may not inherit all of the separate property. And that's oftentimes not what people would have wanted.
Right. In either direction. Sometimes they wouldn't want the spouse to have gotten anything. They wanted the family money to go just straight down to their children.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And if it's one child, if the decedent had one child, the surviving spouse would get 50% and the child would get 50%. And if the decedent had two children, the surviving spouse gets a third, and 2/3 is split equally amongst the children or issue of a predeceased child.
Right. And that's the split, no matter how many children if the decedent had 7 children, it's still 1/3, 2/3. But, the point being the children are going to get some, the spouse is going to get some. Maybe that's what you wanted. Maybe it's really not. I think it's probably almost never what they want. You either want your spouse to get it or you want your kids to get it. Very rare does someone say, oh, I think I want my kids to get 2/3, spouse to get 1/3.
Exactly. Well, and then there's the whole, because they didn't do an estate plan, how do you make these transfers and distributions? And that's a whole nother layer as well. If it's just community property, or if everything was going to the surviving spouse, there's a spousal property petition.
Right.
But if there's that component going to the children that's separate property, that's going to require a probate.
You're going to have to do a probate. Yeah. Because it's not a spouse. Yeah. So yet another reason to not do that, not die intestate, especially if you've got separate property. Yeah.
Right.
Very good point. Okay. Do you have a horror story that you want to share?
Well, a couple. Well, I'll start with one that's just not as much of a horror story, it's just practical, is if there is a probate open to distribute separate property, if the children of the decedent are minors, or the deceased child, the grandkid of the decedent is a minor, then, it starts this issue too of who's representing them in the court proceeding. And that adds a whole nother layer on to the cost expense. They may need to get a guardian ad litem appointed.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point, because a minor child cannot legally inherit. They have to have a guardian to do that. And surprisingly, that person has to be appointed by court. You don't just get to stand up and say, I'm their parent or whatever. So yeah, that is a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of horror stories, probably the one I've seen a couple of times recently is there's no estate plan, there's community property and separate property. Someone has filed for a divorce. The divorce judgment is not entered. And the rules we talked about, the intestate rules, are what is going to apply.
Still apply.
Distribution.
Yeah. So the marriage is not over yet. So what we just talked about, separate property, community property, still applies, even though you're trying to get rid of this person by filing for a divorce. That is a great.
And even if the marital settlement agreement's been signed, it's the judgment, so it's got to be complete. And it's surprising how many people die during this process, or maybe those cases just make their way to our crazy world. I don't know. But
well, they say divorce is very stressful. So,
but you certainly, can imagine the decedent did not want his community property. No. So the soon-to-be ex takes 100% of the community property.
Right. Yeah. That's sort of the classic example of a horror story. Like, oh, that is definitely not what this decedent would have wanted. I had one where this is another little twist on it. Husband and wife had been married for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, quite a long time. And they had purchased during their marriage, the home that they lived in. They purchased it together. They made all the payments, out of their wages, community property. But at the time they purchased it, the wife, no, I'm trying to remember, the husband had very poor credit. And so the mortgage lender said, the mortgage broker said, if you just put the wife, the person with the good credit, on title, you're going to get a much better rate, all these good things. And so they did that. So the home was owned as the separate property of the wife. That's what it said, even though all throughout the marriage, they basically paid for it together. It really truly was community property, but we have this deed that says, no, it's separate property. So we had to go and do a spousal property petition. We had to do all this stuff, and we had to explain to the judge why this should be considered community property. And fortunately it went through. Nobody on the deceased spouse's side objected to it. They were all, willing to go along with it, but that could be a really bad situation if there were survivors on the deceased spouse's side who said, hey, wait a minute, that's separate property. I get my 2/3 or, my half, whatever.
Right. And I think anytime you have to go get court, a spousal property petition or some sort of an instruction, I mean, you're just sort of opening the door for, if a family has that, maybe never care, if it's the blended family situation, you're just sort of opening the door. You're inviting someone to object because they have to get notice of the court proceedings. So you sort of hold your breath.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we really weren't sure because there hadn't been really much communication with the other side of the family about it, but we knew who we had to serve it upon, and we just kind of, crossed our fingers and hoped for the best. And it worked out fine, but that's
right.
It's a lot of extra work too.
Right.
To have to do all of that and jump through those hoops. Okay. Any other stories that you want to share at this point, or tips? Don't die intestate.
Don't die intestate, and make sure you have everything buttoned up as to the character of the property, and revisit it regularly.
Yeah, that's probably those two things. Don't die intestate and keep your plan up to date. There's nothing more important than those two things, I think, in our world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and it's the amount of time and energy and expense that goes to clarifying things after somebody has passed far exceeds getting things done during your lifetime.
Yeah, that is so true. It's always so much easier and cheaper, even though it doesn't feel that way when you're in the middle of it.
Right.
To do it while you're alive ahead of time than to clean up the mess afterwards. That is always more of a hassle and more expensive. So, good advice. Okay. Thank you, Ruth, so much. This was fun. It's fun to talk to someone who does what I do and and just kind of trade stories. So thank you so much. And
thank
you all for joining us today. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I look forward to connecting with you next time.
Great.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Absolute Trust Talk Live. If you enjoyed listening in, then don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen by searching Absolute Trust Talk. While you're there, we would also love for you to leave us a review. And then why not share your favorite episodes with family, friends, or colleagues too? You can find all of our shows and corresponding show notes by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com. You'll also find a variety of other free resources, including our ebooks, videos, blogs, presentations, and more. If you need help with your estate planning or administration, we also offer a free discovery call to help get the process started. You can find more information on booking your session by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com/scheduling. Don't forget to keep an eye out for our next live episode. If you join us for the broadcast, you can submit questions during the show. But if not, don't worry. You can always get in touch with us by sending a quick message to info@absolutetrustcouncil.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.